So Blake is an NU alum, and then he's doing a lot of work with different types of companies of various sizes, getting them through FDA and all of that. So we thought it would be wonderful to hear from him, get some practical tips as people are working on their own med devices and all of that stuff. So Blake, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. And I think we're shooting for 12:45 as the cutoff for the.
I think then we can do questions and answers.
Oh,
I am
okay,
gonna
great.
turn off my screen because then, as we're recording, then your video will show up without my face. So.
Not that we aren't all happy to have it, but thank you very much. And I'm really excited to be here. My name is Blake Wilson. I am a Northeastern alum. I was in the class of '07 in the undergrad psych and philosophy majors. And so what I'm here to talk with you about today is FDA regulation of medical devices, software as a medical device, and use of AI and machine learning in these technologies. Quick background about myself, because, when I was in your shoes, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I actually thought I was going to be a psychiatrist at one point. Went and did my co-ops at an inpatient setting and realized that pathway wasn't for me. But I really, loved working with people and working with patients directly, and ended up going into clinical research just south of Boston at Brown University for a couple of years, and then went on to law school. And so what I actually do for my practice is, I would say, very unusual for attorneys. And what it's really about is taking this intersection of the law, regulations, and understanding technology and scientific, principles in order to help navigate companies through the FDA pre-market approval process. And so, it's kind of interesting because most attorneys obviously just focus on the legal aspect of this, but I actually spend a lot of time bringing my expertise in clinical trial work and also just, scientific discovery in general to bear on helping companies craft the best arguments, understand what the regulatory requirements are going to be for their products, and how to explain everything to the agency afterwards. Because inevitably there are things where companies deviated a little bit from the, what FDA may have thought was the best practices, and coming up with appropriate justifications as to why, through, something that would be considered akin to like a gap analysis, what the company actually did was appropriate, or how we could most readily remediate the, any shortcomings that the FDA is seeing. So I kind of wear this dual hat in those relationships, and I actually work with a lot of companies going through, pre-submissions and, running those sessions with the agency and being the conduit through which the company makes their arguments, and then putting those within the regulatory lens of, what are the thresholds that, FDA needs to meet in order to approve a product, and, how do we stay aligned with principles like least burdensome, which, is the idea that the agency is supposed to ask for enough to address any open questions that they have, but it really shouldn't turn into an academic exercise and go above and beyond what's necessary to approve a product. And, as you probably just heard, my background is in clinical research. After I became an attorney, I actually went back and got a master's in biostatistics. And, I work a lot with companies on clinical trial design, figuring out what the endpoint should be, how much follow-up is necessary, how to analyze the data, drafting clinical study reports. And so, one takeaway that I would say from a career standpoint for anyone who's considering, what their options are is, going into the sciences is absolutely a benefit to any career path I think that you can choose, because you bring in a lot of expertise that people in other departments don't necessarily have. And in this context, I'm referring specifically to, the business people, the legal department. They understand, kind of their framework for how they use things, but there aren't always very adept at applying it over top of scientific requirements. And you would be surprised how nice of a niche area you can carve out for yourself in some of these industries, having the appropriate scientific background. If you decide you don't ultimately, just want to do the research aspect of this, so there's a lot of career opportunities open to you. After you figure out what you want to do. So today, just kind of jumping through the agenda items.
Blake, Blake,
sure.
sorry to, can you please turn on the presentation mode so we can see the slides?
It says I'm sharing my screen. Am I?
So it's showing like all the other slides as well. It's not in presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here we go. Let's see here. Are we better?
I think we can now see the next slide. It's fine. I think if this is the best that can be done, that's fine.
See if there's a skills. Unfortunately, I'm going to say that based on what I'm seeing, this is the best that we can do, unless anyone has a suggestion. Sorry, not a Teams person. I'm more of a Zoom.
Yeah, Blake, just continue.
Here, I think. Okay.
I think this is better. Thank you.
Okay, great. So looking first at FDA's regulatory framework for medical devices, I'm going to go through this very quickly. We have limited time, and there's a lot of slides here. As you can see, there's about 50, but a lot of this is background that I'm happy to share the slide deck with people just so that they have it. Definition of a medical device when we're talking about FDA's regulatory framework, and what's important to note here, I'm not going to actually read through it, is it's extremely broad. It's essentially almost anything that's intended for use in diagnosis of a disease or condition, or it's intended to cure, mitigate, or treat a disease or condition, or affect the structure of the body. And this last part is the caveat that it differentiates it from drugs. And for the device definition, its primary intended purpose isn't through a chemical action or being metabolized. And so it's essentially saying, it's everything that we usually think of with drugs, except if it's being, there's a chemical action or it's being metabolized by the body. So medical device definition is extremely broad and encompasses a lot of different things. Some of the key considerations here when you're thinking about, if you're developing a medical device is, it goes beyond just what you are explicitly thinking of for marketing it. It's really based on what the intent of the manufacturer is when you are coming up with this definition of a medical device, and whether you qualify as one is really not just based on like marketing materials. It's based on the intent of the manufacturer, and sometimes it's based on kind of implicit concepts of what the device could accomplish if it were placed into the market. So you have to be very careful about the functionalities that you're offering with your device, because some functionalities you think of as innocuous may actually expand its intended use beyond what you were actually considering. And since we're talking about AI and software, it's important to note that any product or software function may be regulated by the FDA if it meets this definition. Generally speaking, I'm hearing a ding. Is that just someone
entering? I just had to admit someone.
Oh, okay. So I won't worry about dings then. I thought there might have been a question. Generally speaking, medical devices are broken up into three risk-based categories: Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. Class 1 being low-risk devices. These are, generally products that are 510K exempt. Then there are kind of this low to moderate risk category, which are typically Class 2 devices and would require a 510K notification and clearance prior to being allowed onto the market. And then there's your high-risk devices, which are class 3 products, and those go down the PMA pathway, which is, a PMA is, and we'll go through these pathways a little bit in just a moment, is really akin to what you think of when you think of the drug approval process. You're proving safety and efficacy through a well-controlled and valid clinical trial. So looking at the different marketing pathways, like I said, there's going to be really 3 of these. There's the 510K pathway, which I'm about to talk about. There's going to be a de novo pathway, which is for low to moderate risk devices. And then there's the PMA pathway, which is for high to risk devices. So 510K pathway, and if you talk to anyone in the device industry, this is what they probably know the most about because it's the most common. You go through a pre-market notification process known as the 510K clearance process, and the goal is to demonstrate substantial equivalence to a legally marketed device that's already a class 1 or class 2 product. And you have to show that you have the same intended use and similar technology as the predicate. And typically, about 10 to 15% of applications will include clinical data. So as you can see, the flip side of that is a lot of 510K applications only include non-clinical data in support of the application. And there's about 3,000 to 4,000 of these 510Ks filed annually with the agency. And the pathway is pretty streamlined and straightforward because it's really, covering a lot of products that you wouldn't think of, necessarily as even being devices, but we need to make sure that they comply with certain general and special controls that may be specific to those product categories. Now, if you're thinking about, okay, I need to claim substantial equivalence to a product that's already on the market, you probably see a potential hole here. It's that, well, what if I have a low to moderate risk device that doesn't have a predicate available, that there's nothing on the market currently that is similar enough that I could claim substantial equivalence. Well, FDA addressed this, about 12, 13 years ago, I guess, through what's called the, de novo pathway. And this is what you use when you have a low to moderate risk device. It's not appropriate for a PMA because it's really not high risk class 3, but there's not an appropriate predicate on the market for you to follow. And so what you use is called this de novo pathway, and you file these applications. They're more, I would say, robust and in-depth than what you would see for a 510K. They do typically include clinical data, unlike a 510K application, but they're not at the same level as what's required for a PMA. And specifically, you don't have to include things like manufacturing information in the de novo applications. And same for a 510K. Those also don't include manufacturing information. So that alone in of itself shortens a lot of the review process because you're not trying to, FDA is not trying to double check your SOPs that are in place for good manufacturing practices and for your quality system. And unlike the 510K pathway, which is based off of substantial equivalence, what we're really looking for here is the benefits outweigh the potential risks. And that's the regulatory threshold there. Again, for PMAs, this is the highest risk category. You have to have all your, preclinical or non-clinical and clinical data ready for this one. And you're also going to need your manufacturing information. You'll likely have to go through a BIMO audit of your clinical data before you get an approval. And you could potentially have to go through a panel hearing with the FDA to actually get a PMA approval. And you may also have post-approval studies requirements with this type of application, which is different than what you see with the lower risk products. This is just a handy chart. Again, I'm not going to go through it in any detail because I want to make sure that we stay on track with time. But, it kind of gives you the rundown of, if you go down the PMA pathway, the de novo pathway, or the 510K pathway, what are the relevant considerations? What are the data requirements going to be? How long are my applications going to have to be? And importantly, if I can find it here at the bottom, what are my review times going to be? As you can see with a 510K, FDA gets 90 days to review your application. With de novos, by statute, it's 120. FDA actually gets 150 under their MDUFA agreements with industry for user fees. And then for PMA, it's 180 days. Now, what I would note is that these are FDA review days that are associated with this. So if FDA stops the clock because they issued an additional information request to the company during the application process, those days don't count to the overall timeline. But I am going to show you briefly, kind of what the review times are looking like for these different types of applications. And these are just some like rough numbers that we usually throw out, but the time to approval, for a PMA, it's usually a year to a year and a half. De novo, I think it's probably closer to a year at this point, depending. But then, for a 510K, you could go file and go all the way through the process in maybe like 6 to 8 months, usually. The user fees are also much different between these, as you can see. For 510K, it's about 21,000. De novos are at about 145,000, and then PMAs are starting to peak close to $500,000. There are small business designations available that you can get, which you have to reapply for each year, but they can substantially reduce the amount of the user fee. As you can see, PMAs dropped from 468,000 to 120,000 roughly. So similarly robust savings across the other applications as well. So, you're getting ready to go in, you have an idea of what your marketing application pathway is going to be. What are types of things that you can do to help facilitate the process? I always recommend that companies utilize the pre-submission process. And what this is you get an opportunity to put in front of the agency what you believe your regulatory pathway is going to be, what types of data that you would use to support your future application, be it, the non-clinical testing, which might be EMC testing or electrical safety testing. It might be biocompatibility, sterilization testing, or even clinical study design. And so the benefit of this is that you get some initial buy-in from the agency on, are your proposed intended uses appropriate for the product and for what you believe your regulatory pathway is and what your data development plan is. So you can put in, small pre-submissions that focus just on an individual issue, or you can put in what I like to call omnibus pre-submissions that cover, potentially the whole gauntlet of different questions that you may have regarding your future marketing application and what you're going to need to support it. FDA usually gives you a meeting within about 75 days. And so you get an in-person meeting, you get written feedback prior to that meeting, and then you get meeting minutes afterwards. And those are very useful in helping you drill down on specific points that you have questions about, particularly if you're developing a novel product and what type of information you may need to be supplying to the agency in order to support that application. The breakthrough designation program is one thing that I just wanted to touch on briefly. It's specially geared towards devices that have the potential to be more effective in treatment or diagnosis of a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating disease or condition, and that represent some form of novelty, either as a breakthrough technology or adding a significant advantage over other cleared and approved products. And the benefit of the breakthrough designation program, I would say, is really twofold at least. First, it's great for fundraising. It's nice to be able to say that you're a part of the breakthrough designation program. It also makes you eligible for what they call sprint interactions with the agency, which is essentially you get a shortened timeline for getting feedback on those pre-submissions that you want to file. The trade-off is you have to narrow down what the specific questions are that you're going to be asking the agency, but you can essentially cut the time frames in half, and there's no limit on the number of sprint interactions that you can have with the agency. So this is a very useful, pre-filing your marketing application designation to to get. A more recent program is also the TAP program. Only certain device types that have already been granted breakthrough designation can get into this program. But essentially, this is, a heightened, interactive program with the agency where they actually work with you and with potentially like CMS and other government organizations on, really how to develop your product and make sure that you're going to be a success in actually marketing that by heightening your chances of getting an effective reimbursement code, or if you have other, issues that you need to address with the agency. This is a relatively new program, TAP. It's only been around for 2 years at this point, but a lot of the companies that I've taken through to get, breakthrough designation and then get into the TAP program have been extremely happy with their level of involvement. So I told you we would quickly touch on just FDA review timelines. And again, just so that we stay on track, I'm going to do this relatively quickly. For 510Ks, the timeline is typically 120 to 150 total days. There's a lot of variability based on the complexity. And the way that the process goes, and this is true for essentially all the marketing applications, is you put in the complete marketing application. FDA takes a certain amount of time up front. It's usually somewhere between a half to 2/3 of their review time. And then they send you what's called a request for additional information. That stops the clock. You have 180 days to respond to that. And then once you put in your complete response, you restart the clock and they have whatever the delta is left. So in the case of a 510K, say you file, FDA takes 60 days to do their initial review. They send you their list of questions by day 60. You respond after that, after, taking the time to address their questions. They have the rest of the 30 days to day 90 to finish up their review and have a final determination. 510Ks are often cleared. There's about an 85% success rate. The rest of those are either withdrawn or receive a not substantially equivalent determination, but we are quite successful in getting these through. De novos, on the other hand, have a very low success rate, which is around the 50 percentile range, sometimes a little bit lower depending on the year. This is probably the area where I focus the most, is de novos and PMAs, because it involves more clinical data and I work with more novel products typically. And if you're doing anything in the AI space, a lot of times you will end up in the de novo pathway, especially if you're looking at a new indication that hasn't been on the market before. And these are just de novo timelines for review. And as you can see, like there were some spikes early on in the early 2000s, and then it kind of teetered off around that like mid 200s to occasionally you'll hit up into the threes, but then it drops back down. So a lot of the times those are based off of getting historical files, actually a decision on those, and that's what kicks up those mean times. PMAs, as you can see, we're kind of teetering around the mid 300s to sometimes up into the 4s for those review timelines for total time. So regulation of software specifically by the agency. Under 21st century cures, and it's easier if we kind of start back in 2016. This is at the very end of Obama's administration, because there was a lot of questions around how FDA was going to regulate software, especially software-only medical devices. There were a lot of people within industry and even in Congress saying, they didn't think that FDA had the authority to regulate. FDA was obviously saying quite the opposite. And they thought that they should be regulating, essentially everything that could be considered a medical device, no matter how low risk. And so Congress steps in and they put into 21st century cures some provisions that exclude certain types of software functionality that are considered low risk. And these are things like administrative work, things around health and wellness, EHR systems, and technology that's really just about the storage and transfer and display of information. So not anything that's manipulating or analyzing it. There's also something called clinical decision support software, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail because this has been an area of flux. But the idea is that anything that's software, even if it's only software, could be a medical device if they meet the medical device definition. However, if you are low risk, there are oftentimes exceptions, either through guidance document or through statute, that take you outside of outside of the medical device definition. And so if you're considered a low risk medical device product, you can sometimes stay under what's called enforcement discretion or be considered just not a medical device at all. So it's always important to consider where you are on that risk continuum, because it can either put you in FDA's regulatory crosshairs, or you can stay under the radar and not have to go through a lot of the additional processes and manufacturing processes that you would need if you were an FDA regulated product. And a lot of times, what I work with companies on is they have an initial version of their device that may qualify for one of these exceptions. And after they've been on the market, they've been collecting data, maybe they had time to run a clinical trial while they were marketing their product, they then go and get more robust claims based on that additional information. So they start out as either an unregulated device or as a device that's operating under enforcement discretion because it's so low risk. And then when they're ready to make their stronger marketing claims, they go to the agency to get that 510(k) clearance or de novo or PMA. So again, these are kind of the general pathways that you have for digital health, software type products. Again, exactly what I was saying, you could potentially not be a medical device because you're exempted from the medical device definition. There could be some sort of enforcement discretion available through guidance document, like a general wellness product, or under the mobile medical apps guidance that FDA has, where they've actively said, these technically qualify as medical devices, but we are not going to actively regulate them at this time. Then there are actively regulated medical devices, which, as I described before, class 1, class 2, and class 3 type products. And there's also regulated combination products. And what you can imagine these as is in precision medicine, potentially software that's helping you to either, diagnose a specific condition so that it can be treated by another, drug or biologic, or potentially something that's being incorporated into an IDD to identify some sort of a biomarker that may be relevant to treatment, either by indicating whether a patient should or should not be treated, or by indicating what dosage level or how that patient should be managed. And those are considered combination products. Enforcement discretion, these types of things help patients like self-manage their disease or condition without providing specific treatment or treatment suggestions. When you're thinking of, kind of enforcement discretion, these are like particularly low risk devices. Some examples here: software that uses GPS for environmental conditions for asthma. You could have a device that, helps remind people to do certain, cognitive behavioral therapy activities, to help with their anxiety or their depression. Or there could be software functionality that provides historical trending or comparison of vital signs to help give you insight about your condition, but it's not telling you anything about it. It's not making a diagnosis. It's not claiming that it's treating anything. And so these types of very low risk products can sometimes fall under enforcement discretion. You need to be very careful. And this will be a common theme about how you market and what types of claims you make in order to stay within that enforcement discretion. General wellness products are also a category that falls into this general area. And what these products are really about, and you'll certainly see them around, kind of like mental health, wellness, sleeping, and things like that, is it's about maintaining or encouraging a general state of health, or helping to live with a chronic disease or condition. And when we talk about a chronic disease or condition, you can talk about something like high blood pressure, and you could have a device that reminds you about good eating habits or something like that. And you could say that, good eating habits in connection with healthy living helps, people diagnosed with high blood pressure, like live better with their disease or condition. So it's can have a disease reference, but it's in a very rote and meticulous format for the type of marketing claims that you can make. Needs to be a chronic condition, and needs what you are doing with your product needs to be very closely tied to improvements in health, just kind of general health for that patient population. You don't have to put in an application for general wellness products, but you should always have something on hand, like a memo that analyzes why you believe you fall within that class, so that if FDA ever comes around and says, hey, we think that your product could be a medical device that's regulated, could you let us know your justification for not seeking a 510K notice or other marketing application for this product? And at that point, you would say, oh, yeah, here's my memo analyzing it. And if you turn it around quickly, and it's obviously should be dated and signed and incorporated into your device history, then it gives the FDA the distinct impression that you are up to date and keeping track of your regulatory obligations, which can be very helpful. CDS guidance and pre-specified change control plans. We're actually going to talk about the pre-specified change controls after we talk about AI. So this first part is just going to be about CDS. What is CDS? This is clinical decision support software. Any software function that's intended to support clinical decision making, and it could be things like computerized alerts, reminders for healthcare practitioners. They could be clinical guidelines, diagnostic support, things of those nature. CDS ranges from very simple automations of routine clinical calculations to more complex, algorithms that may be using AI or other information to cull information and provide additional supportive background. Now we're going to go through, where exactly the parameters are and where CDS that's not a medical device starts to trip into CDS that's a regulated product, because this has been a big issue for industry since the final guidance document came out. So under 21st Century Cures, we received a more discrete definition of this. What CDS is, it must meet 4 categories. You must not acquire, process, or analyze medical images or signals. You can display, analyze, or print medical information. That's okay. It's used to support or provide recommendations to the HCP, and it can be enabled, or it must be enabled so HCPs can independently review the basis for the software's recommendations. And so a lot of this is around, you're not, taking the decision making away from the HCP. You're really just providing general background information at a high level, and then you need to make clear to the industry exactly how you're making those decisions, why you're providing certain information in certain cases. So there's a transparency component to it, which is very key also to the AI space.
இல்ல நான் ஒரு ஒரு மீட்டிங் ஒன்று அட்டன் பண்ண சொன்னாங்க. அதுக்கு அது 9
And
மணிக்கு
Derek, you can
ஜாயின்
put
பண்ணணும்.
yourself on mute
9:30
while we're
ஆகுதா?
on this call, or
இவ்வளோ
I'll try and do it.
I have muted him.
Okay, thank you. So looking at the CDS guidance document, FDA after 21st Century Cures comes out, they come out with a guidance document to interpret what non-device CDS is, and within that context, it's really about the transparency again. For the software has to clearly explain its purpose, intended use, who the intended user is, what the outputs are that are going to be generated, and the rationale or support for the recommendation. So it's about giving all this background information. Now, when the final guidance document comes out, we receive some additional clarification on criterion 4, which is an independent reviewability of the recommendation remains important. So they wanted to reemphasize this idea about transparency. And with respect to criteria number 3, you must provide the condition, disease, or patient-specific recommendations to enhance, inform, or influence, while it's not intended to replace the HCP's judgment. So this is very important, because sometimes, like alarms or alerts, you want to just be saying like, oh, you should come around and like look at this patient, or they crossed a certain threshold, so an alarm went off. But you have to be careful that that's not going to then be used as the HCP's judgment. Like, is the HCP now just relying on your CDS software to get those alerts and are not checking in on the patients otherwise on that specific parameter that you're monitoring. So the idea here is, again, you need to build in safeguards into your system to make sure that HCPs are not overly relying on it. And this becomes much more important in time critical decision making. Again, when alerts are being taken into consideration, or when the algorithm may be making recommendation about treatment options or things like that. You have to be extremely tailored in how you're doing that. And as the risks, because of the critical time component, become greater, then it starts to look more and more like you're going to be replacing an HCP's judgment, because they won't have time to go through the assessment and analyze additional information necessarily, and they may become overly reliant. This is just some additional background, some non-device CDS examples, a list of follow-up or next step options about, like, what's happening following a doctor's appointment. So, after office visit, hospitalization, a procedure that may be recommended, based on certain information that you put into the system, things like that, where, again, there's not like a time crunch with these things. The physician can make their determination, obviously, or the HCP, as to what the next appropriate follow-up is going to be, but you may have an algorithm that's going to make some recommendations to them. A list of drug-drug interactions or drug allergy contraindication notifications. This is obviously extremely useful, and it's great that it's a non-device CDS, because you want to be able to provide it to the HCPs, because all you're doing is taking information that's really publicly available, and you're saying, oh, you're prescribing this drug, here's a list of the other the drug-drug interactions for that product. And so it just throws it up on a screen for you. It makes it really easy and kind of takes the task of that individual having to go through the process to look up, the labeling for that specific drug out of it. So this can be, very helpful. And I think the final CDS guidance document, while not particularly well received by industry, because a lot of things started to look like they were medical devices because of the type of decision-making outputs that they were making. So people weren't exactly happy with it, but I think FDA did try and keep certain very low-risk aspects of CDS within the, you're just not a medical device. So I think that was helpful. These are just some examples of devices that end within the CDS space that obviously ended up as devices. Again, time critical alarms, alerts intended to trigger potential clinical intervention. So again, there's like this kind of risk timing. You need to take into consideration the disease or condition in which your product would be used, and what it's identifying. And if you did that, like, what is the risks if person didn't act on the information, because that's going to play a lot into whether you trip the line into becoming a regulated device or not. We are now going to expand from, just considering software as a medical device into AI. AI is an exciting space. It's really incredible what's being accomplished today. I would say that the agency, in terms of regulating the space, is a bit behind where we would hope to be. But partly that's because it moves so fast, and the frameworks of government do not. They move relatively slowly. People always want guidance documents to be published quickly. The problem is the level of review that they have to go through. There's a lot of notice and comment involved from a legal perspective. And then the risk is, you're putting out principles that may be outdated potentially by the time you actually get to publishing a final guidance document. Fortunately, within my work at the Device Center, I see a lot of how AI is incorporated and validated within medical products, and what types of things the agency is looking for when you want to incorporate AI. And that is helping to inform principles when we are now taking AI and moving it into other space, like drug development, into quality system management, and even into some just regular business contexts, like picking vendors and things like that. Sorry. So AI and medical products, just as some background, FDA has received 300 plus submissions of drug biologic products with an AI component, and there are over 700 AI enabled devices that have been cleared or approved by FDA. And AI-enabled devices can really go into any number of different products. So AI could be incorporated into things that are not medical devices, like EHR systems. They can be incorporated into devices that are subject to enforcement discretion under traditional regulation as a Class 2 or Class 3 product. Think of a lot of your Apple products incorporate a lot of AI that are in the device space and are cleared, for AFib detection, or the hearing aid has some AI in it. I believe that FDA that Apple came out with its pods, and obviously, and I went through this kind of at the beginning with combination products. Where you're seeing more AI. So, AI is not just for one type of product, it can really be incorporated anywhere. And current state of things, when we're looking at AI, and when clients come to me and say, okay, I've got AI in my product, there's a couple of things that I need to inform them of that are FDA's expectations. And I would say the first thing is that this frustrates everyone, especially people in Silicon Valley. FDA only accepts locked algorithms, and that's an extreme challenge because everyone's thinking, oh, I've got this like AI ML component to my product. I want to keep feeding in new data to it. I want to keep training the algorithm, and I want to keep improving it. And from FDA's standpoint, algorithms are locked when they get cleared. So when you file your marketing application, you actually have a locked algorithm, which kind of changes the idea of, oh, my device has an AI component to it, to I developed my product using AI, but the algorithm, sits stagnant afterwards, which can be very frustrating. But currently, that's where we are. There are some limited exceptions on what's called a pre-specified change control plan, but the types of changes that you can make without going back to the agency are pretty limited, and we'll talk about that briefly. FDA clears specific indications, not platform technologies. So you have to have what your device is specifically going to be used for. You can't just say, I have this technology and I can feed in whatever data I want and come up with outputs for it. So they don't again clear the platform technology. They clear a technology that's for a specific indication, for diagnosis of a specific condition, for likelihood of reoccurrence of breast cancer, or epileptic seizures. I think I heard earlier, like those would all be FDA clearances for a specific indication. A lot of AI ML devices are granted marketing authorization through the de novo pathway. As I was mentioning before, there's usually a clinical data that's used to support it. FDA has multiple guidance documents out there about artificial intelligence and machine learning in medical products that are definitely worth reviewing. These are just some examples, and we don't have a ton of time, so I'm not going to leave them up on the screen for too long. But where you see a lot of AI being used is within, assessment of different diagnostic images or treatment planning. Uses a lot of, I would say, AI ML, or in, I was mentioning the Apple Watch with the AFib certainly has an AI component, and a lot of other products, some of which you'd be surprised by, were at least partially developed using AI. So again, a lot of it's in the diagnostic space or the planning space, I would say, but treatment models are also starting to incorporate an AI component where the AI is helping make a decision about the exact treatment parameters. And you can imagine that within a neurological stimulation or something like that, where they're helping decide, or even with, which type of custom implant that you should receive may have an AI component to it, which kind of marries together the custom device regulations with a product that's intended to be more broadly applicable to the patient population. Supporting data for AI. Part of the challenges that we always run into, ground truthing can be an issue. So you need to be assessing your output against whatever the ground truth is, but what is the gold standard for what you're trying to identify? If it's something particularly novel, there may not be a realistic ground truth. And then, you need to go through that pre-submission process with the agency to understand how exactly you would do the ground truthing. How do you assess what your product does and make sure that it's valid? You have to have really, I would say, 3 different buckets of data at least. You have your training data, that you use to actually train your algorithm. Then you have the validation of that trained algorithm using completely separate data. And then you'll have to run a prospective clinical trial typically afterwards. Depending on what your indication for use is, you may be able to get away with retrospective data. It really depends on what type of output that you want to make based on it. The important thing is there could be no overlap between the three sets. So if you're using, especially if you're using the retrospective data as your kind of clinical study, the training data needs to be separate from the validation data, which both need to be separate from your clinical study data. And FDA is getting much more meticulous about understanding how your algorithm was trained and where the data was coming from and what background information you have on those patients. It used to be, 10 years ago when I was doing this, we could say, oh, it's a data set from Harvard that shows ECG reads. And that was honestly like kind of sufficient for them. They now want a lot about the background of these patients, what type of concomitant medication they might have been on, what all the demographic information, potentially follow-up that would be like after the reads that you would be running through your algorithm to train your algorithm. And FDA wants it to be from like different areas within the country. They would, typically want urban settings and rural settings. They want centers of excellence, but they want, just regular hospitals also. They're very adamant that they just don't want academic centers anymore at universities. And so there's a lot to consider now, I would say, than there was 10 years ago about like how you're training your algorithm exactly. And this kind of flies in the face of, I think, a lot of tech development, which is that, well, if I run my clinical trial and it works, that's the end of the story. With FDA, we've really, I think, progressed on this point to, no, I need to understand more about how it was trained, why you believe the inputs are relevant to your specific product and to your specific output, and then matching that up to your actual prospective clinical trial or retrospective study, however you end up running it. So a lot of this needs to be dealt with very early on in the process. And so that's where, someone like me comes in to help figure that out and tell the story in the best way possible. Predetermined change control plans. Like I said, a lot of products incorporate AI or ML, but people hate that you have to freeze the algorithm. FDA is slowly progressing into the idea that you can have changes to the product without needing to go back to the agency. That's why they put out or predetermined, not pre-specified, predetermined change control plans. But they're very limited in what you can do. And as you can see, the types of things that you need to have in here are what the modifications are going to be. You need a modification protocol and an impact statement. And the idea is that any changes that you would be making would need to be an improvement, obviously, over the product. It's not just, a meaningful improvement. You can't just make updates to make updates. And so this, in very small text, I apologize for that, is the considerations that they're taking into account. And again, what I would say is the takeaway from this is there's very limited opportunities to have a predetermined change control plan. The types of things that you can change are very small. It's not going to be adding in like a subpopulation or something like that, unless it's a very limited area where you likely already had data available and maybe you're just adding a little bit more to it as you start to market the product and collect real world evidence. But a lot of times it's going to be around the fringes. And maybe just adding in more data and getting, better results with your product. So these are all, I would say, important things to consider is that while there are opportunities for predetermined change control plans, currently they're going to be pretty limited by the agency in terms of, what you will be able to change with your product without having to go back to the agency to get a new clearance or approval. And these are just some examples, and I know that we're at the top of the time. So approaching the FDA, just to kind of reiterate what I said before, there's, the pre-submission process, which is honestly really great. I can't advocate for people enough to go in early and talk with the agency. I think there's a lot of hesitancy around doing that. But if you engage someone who's familiar with the process, you can really fine tune a submission to get the most out of your feedback with the agency. And the benefits of doing that will shorten a lot of the work that you have to do later on. So I think it's worthwhile. The other place that you should go if you have questions is the Digital Health Center at FDA. They usually have like a 2-week turnaround if you have questions about your product, and you can kind of ask it at high level, how something might be regulated. If it gets too in the weeds, they'll tell you to file a pre-sub or a request for designation. But you can usually prompt them first as a quick way to gut check some of your ideas. And I think we're going to call it there. How do we do on time? A little bit over.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
I think it was well, and this was very informative, so that's good. So we have a few minutes left, about 8 minutes. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to come off camera, and then you can ask Blake directly. Blake, please do send us the slide deck, because then PG can circulate it. And we will
Absolutely.
obviously post this through our YouTube channels and all that. So this was really informative. And we have a mix of people listening to you, faculty members, postdocs, graduate students, as well as like other alumni and undergrads. So there was a comment, maybe we can just get started there. So as with like a patent application, people say, right, you have to publish all of this so other people learn from it and all of that, so they can come up with improvements or find other ways to go around it. So Karen wrote that when you apply, you must supply details in 5110K summary, and thus potentially sensitive information to competitors. So how do you think about that in terms of this space?
So I would say if you go through and look at the 510K summaries, the information that you're providing in there is typically pretty high level. It's things like, what types of non-clinical testing did you conduct? What is the, device description in high level terms? Did you run a clinical study or not? What were the high level results? Honestly, like for a lot of this, and with respect to the clinical trial information, is either available through a publication that you already put out, or it might be available on clinicaltrials.gov, where you need to register your clinical trials. So there is hesitancy, and you need to be careful about what you put into it. You don't want to put too much information into your 510K summary, but there's a lot of leeway still, I would say, to keep very critical information or confidential information out. And you certainly don't need to disclose anything that is confidential or proprietary to your product. So you don't have to disclose your algorithm or exactly what goes into it. So I think that there's a lot of leeway to keep things safe while still, kind of matching up with what's going to be in your labeling that will be publicly available also.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Can you talk a little bit more about slide number 34 and 38? So one was around CDS, and then another one. I think they were very informative.
Let me get back to 34.
While Blake is doing that, if you guys enjoyed this webinar, you will really enjoy the next one, where an IP firm will talk about strategies on filing claims and all of that around AI for life sciences and devices and all of that.
Right.
So this was.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Blake.
I was just looking quickly over slide 34, which again was around CDS, and CDS is clinical decision support software. And the idea here, kind of the high level takeaway, is you want to be supporting HCPs. You want to be making recommendations, but the way that your product is intended to be used can't essentially end up supplanting their own the HCP's judgment and decision making. And one of the concepts that was on that slide 34, again, I'm happy to circulate this deck, is that there needs to be sufficient time. So, I mentioned, that critical time for decision making, depending on what you're identifying. If the thing that you're identifying would need immediate action that would not allow an HCP to, conduct additional review of other outputs on other, devices or things like that, or, input their own judgment before it would be too late, then you're likely going to be a device that's CDS rather than a non-device that's CDS. And so again, the question here is really around the level of risk associated with it, and are you either intentionally or unintentionally going to be supplanting the HCP's decision making?
Are there any other questions? Carol, Chris?
There is,
Anybody?
okay.
All right. So then the other question I had was like, how do people manage it on the compliance side? So if something is cleared as a CDS or like essentially not cleared, then how do they manage it? Where like, who has this responsibility to make sure that HCP is not fully depending on this just because people get used to things, right? They expect that there will be some sort of like an alert if something goes. So how do
Right.
people manage that?
So at the end of the day, it's a lot around how you're marketing the product. And this is where your sales reps become extremely important to like understand exactly what they're saying to hospital systems or to practitioners about what your product can be used for and the way that's appropriate to use it. Again, FDA is making, when they're looking at these things, FDA is making their best judgment on do they think that it would supplant HCP's decision-making process or their judgment. How people end up using in the field can obviously start to deviate a little bit from that, and you may need to put in more robust warnings or contraindications about how your product can be used in order to stay clear of potentially supplanting the decision making of an HCP. So a lot of it has to do with labeling and frankly just how it's being marketed. And if you become aware that it's being used in a certain way, you need to make a risk analysis. Are these kind of like one-off cases, or do you need to make updates to the labeling or how you discuss the product with people, or potentially modify a functionality so that you take away the time critical aspect of it or the high risk consideration that's causing people to rely on it in lieu of medical judgment.
So I think we only have like a minute and a half left. This was really informative. So I think that's I really want to highlight that part. So one piece which I would like to know more about is like this, how do people manage? So because if they have AI or a model in the background and the agency is expecting it to be closed, but if it is learning on its own, like how do people manage that? Like a company manages it. Does
Right.
that become like a product 2.0 or what
Yeah, that
happens?
that is essentially like a developmental beta product that you have that's separate from. But what your medical device actually is the locked algorithm. Is the like essentially that final form of the AI algorithm that was created when you were putting in your marketing application, and that's what all of your software documentation that you're submitting to the agency, all the validation needs to be run on the V&V testing for software, cybersecurity assessments all need to be run on that final version that you're going to be submitting to the agency. So yeah, you can still have it in the background collecting information and learning from it, but that's considered just a beta version. That's research on your end. There's obviously considerations people should take about collecting real world evidence to be put into the model and making sure that you're not doing anything that's a privacy concern or in violation of HIPAA or some other potential healthcare statute. So you definitely want to take that into consideration as well, make sure you're getting the appropriate consents from patients. But that is separate from what your cleared product is.
All right. So I think we are almost out of time. There
Well,
is
we have
one
one
hand up,
hand up, yeah.
Shambhavi. Yeah, Shambhavi.
Hi, thank you so much, Blake, for your amazing presentation and covering PCCP. So I had a question regarding 510K process. So
Mhm.
what if this predicate device which we used for substantial equivalence is recalled by FDA later? So do I need to provide additional data for my device?
Once you are cleared and on the market, it's not going to be an issue for you. However, you should be concerned to make sure that you look at why exactly that device was recalled and is it something that that affects your risk analysis for your own product. But once you get the clearance, the fact that the product that you depended on as the predicate device is recalled does not impact your specific clearance. But again, you should take into consideration, is it because there was a device failures based on principles of operation, or was there something in the background that they weren't, they didn't have a strong quality system in place or something along those lines that implemented the recall?
Thank you.
No problem.
All right, Peter, do you want to close it up?
Well, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Again, if you could send the PowerPoint presentation, we'll forward it to everybody that came today. And we appreciate your time.
Great. Sounds great. Thank you for having me, and hope to speak with some of you, in the future.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you.